Good evening. My name is David Gibson. I'm the director of the Center on Religion and Culture here at Fordham, and I want to welcome you all to our event this evening, Pope Francis, Reform and Resistance. We're going to have biographer Austen Ivereigh on the fate of the papacy. And if that isn't dramatic enough, then you haven't been following Twitter on the Amazon Synod. Austen is the author of a new biography called Pope Francis called Wounded Shepherd, Pope Francis's Struggle to Convert the Catholic Church. Now that biography officially releases tomorrow, yet we're fortunate to get an exclusive sneak peek preview courtesy of Austen's presentation this evening, and you'll also have a chance to buy a copy of the book afterwards, along with a complimentary glass of wine and some nibbles, courtesy of the CRC. So please join us, stay afterwards and join us for that. Now, some of you who have been following that recent synod on the Amazon also wondered if we had replicas of the pagan Pachamama idols. Alas, those did not arrive in time. I just saw a video of somebody, a Mexican priest, ceremonially burning them. Yes. Those of you who may not have any idea of what I'm talking about are probably convinced that I've lost my mind. Well, let me introduce you to the Catholic Church in the pontificate of Pope Francis, Francis derangement syndrome. That's how it is. Austen will, I trust, explain all of this to you and what it means. And certainly no one is better positioned for that task, truly, than Austen Ivereigh. I've often said that waiting for the name of a new pope to be announced as you're standing there in St. Peter's Square is one of the most fraught moments for any Catholic, which probably says a lot about the state of Catholicism when there's so much dependent on it. But it's also especially nerve-wracking if you're a journalist and in an instant you have to be an expert on one of the 110 or 120 cardinals whose name is announced as the next pope. There are no primaries to kind of prepare you, to get you ready, and the handicappers always get it wrong, so you really never know who it's going to be. So imagine you're Austen Ivereigh on the evening of March 13th, 2013, when Cardinal Jorge Mario Bergoglio of Buenos Aires is announced as Pope Francis. And you're Austen Ivereigh, who's a longtime Catholic writer and commentator, who in 1993 completed his thesis at Oxford titled Catholicism and Politics in Argentina, an interpretation with special reference to the period 1930 to 1960. And Francis was born in 1936, ordained in 1963, and you speak Spanish, and so the stars are perfectly aligned for you to be the biography of that cardinal who was just elected pope. And all of the other journalists in the Vatican Press Corps grumble underneath their breath. Congratulations. But hence his first biography, The Great Reformer, Francis and the Making of a Radical Pope, was such a great success and was received with such great acclaim, and deservedly so. It's a terrific book, and I was honored to give it a blurb alongside Philadelphia Archbishop Charles Chaput. Now, if that doesn't tell you something about the promise of Pope Francis and the talent of Austen Ivereigh, then nothing else does. In any case, it was a great book, and if it does lead me to believe that past performance is indeed going to be an indicator of future results. Now, just to let you know how the evening will go, Austen is going to speak for about 45 minutes on his book and on all the goings-on at the Vatican, from whence he just returned after nearly a month and innumerable bowls of pasta. And then he will be joined on the dais by Mary Kate Holman, a teaching fellow in the Fordham Theology Department, who will lead a conversation with Austen, and she will field your questions as well from these two microphones which we have up here. Now, Austen Ivereigh, over to you.
Thank you very much indeed, David. So yes, this book is going to be launched, in fact, tomorrow at America Magazine headquarters. And I said to David before, he's a long-time journalist, as many of you know. This will not be the first time that he's scooped America Magazine having me here. But it's really delightful to be here. I'm so happy to have this opportunity. I'm still slightly groggy, having just flown in and after a month in Rome. But I hope I make some sense. The first book was called The Great Reformer. This one has a rather more humble title. Jim Martin, my friend, many of you know, Jesuit friend, when I told him this title, he said, "Oh my God, what's the third one going to be called? You know, Pope Francis 6 feet under." But there is a reason for this. And I saw Pope Francis just the other day to hand him the book. And I explained to him that the reason I'd chosen the title was that he himself has spoken about how we need to be a church which shows its wounds. And of course, the theology of it, you will get to be a church that embraces its wounds is to allow itself also to be healed by our Saviour, who also is the wounded Saviour. So that's really the reason for the title. And the subtitle is obviously provocative. We like provocative titles. I could have gone for the word reform again, but actually I've come to realize in studying this Pope and this pontificate that the reform to which he's calling the church, or the reform that he is carrying out, is really a call to conversion. And this has ended up really being a book about conversion, the process of conversion. That's the big theme of it. And so the theme tonight that David's asked me to talk about, reform and resistance, is really spot on that topic, because, of course, whenever you have conversion, you have resistance to conversion. In fact, one might say, if you follow the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius, that the moment of conversion is often where we encounter the greatest resistance. And so, in a way, it's an important topic in the book as well, as has turned out in this pontificate, that the resistance, if you like, is part of the story of this pontificate. Francis himself is very relaxed about this. As you know, whenever he's spoken about this, he likes to quote a phrase attributed to Don Quixote, but I'm not sure whether it actually is in Don Quixote. In Spanish, "Ladran los perros, Sancho, señal de que avanzamos." The dogs are barking, Sancho. It's a sign we're moving ahead. You know, so when you're on your horses and you're setting off, the dogs are all barking. It's a sign of progress. It's a sign that things are happening. Now, I want to draw a distinction right at the start between criticism of the Pope and resistance to the Pope, because criticism is an absolutely right and normal and healthy part of public life. And popes should be criticized, and this is a pope who actually welcomes criticism and likes criticism. And he himself talks about the importance of opposition of goodwill, people who care about the church, who are concerned that he is doing the wrong things or he's not moving fast enough. I'm sure many of you in this room have many criticisms of the Pope. Why not? He himself does of himself. So the distinction between criticism and what he would call an opposition of the bad spirit, in Ignatian terms. And he draws the distinction really between two kinds. One is the hidden resistance of those who throw stones but then hide their hands. In other words, who pretend to be loyal but in fact are busy undermining you. And then the other kind with which we're more familiar, particularly in the last few years, and particularly since the launch of Amoris Laetitia, which is what he would call the malicious resistance of those who brazenly denounce and accuse others, and indeed accuse him, while dressing themselves in the mantle of tradition and orthodoxy. Now, this is the resistance that I want to talk about tonight, that it's really a resistance to accepting the legitimacy and the authority of the papacy. It's a resistance to Francis's teaching and his reforms. It's a failure to recognize that he is the anointed one of the Holy Spirit, that he has, that he's not the legitimate pope. Now, some, of course, will go so far as even to claim that. But most of the criticism, most of the resistance against Francis isn't so brazenly open like that, but rather is a kind of distrustful self-withholding, a distrust of the Pope, a skepticism about him. And to use a phrase that he likes very much, to treat him with a hermeneutic of suspicion, so that almost everything he says and does needs to be filtered through this ideology of suspicion. And I know you're very familiar with what I'm talking about. And this group of people, and we can talk in a minute about who they are and where they are, has emerged as a divisive party, essentially, within the contemporary church, which sees itself and offers, indeed, an alternative to the magisterium of Francis, and is working hard, actively in some cases, to undermining him. Now, I don't think I'm not being rhetorical here. I think I'm just stating the facts. So it's an attack on the Pope's leadership, and this is very important, that this is a direct attack on his leadership. And ultimately, therefore, one might argue on Christ, given that he is the one anointed by Christ to lead the church. I mean, that's what we believe as Catholics in the conclave. Now, of course, they don't see it that way, and all, if you like, resistance within the church is always justified in the name of the church and in the name of saving the church. So it's partly the rhetoric of needing to save the church from itself, and usually done in the name of tradition, which is usually defined by these critics as something which is outside what we would regard as the living development of the church. So it's the conceit or the narrative that Francis is not, his papacy is not an outworking of the Second Vatican Council and the tradition of the recent papacies, but rather in some way breaks with that tradition. It is the attitude, I suspect, really, of a certain conservative Catholic elite, especially in the United States, who view the papacy through this suspicion of this hermeneutic of suspicion. Now, I want to suggest tonight that and I say this in the book, that I think what you see when you look at a lot of the writings about Francis is you see, to use a very old word in the early church, you see a lot of invidia. Invidia is a great word. It's a Latin word from which, of course, we get the word envy. But it really means a not seeing, a kind of a blindness. And it's the envy characteristically of the Pharisees when they are with Jesus. In other words, here we have Jesus, who is clearly a person of power, of authority, and they recognize that. There are healings, the people follow him, and so on. But they're unable to accept that authority. In other words, they're threatened by it, and they seek to undermine it. They seek, in fact, to destroy it. And I found myself, while writing the book, because as I was writing it, I started really in 2016 when Amoris Laetitia came out, and I realized that it was insufficient to do what I was doing. I had to account in some way for this resistance. And I found myself thinking a lot about the Pharisees and Jesus, particularly in John's Gospel. And we don't speak very often, do we, about the Pharisaical opposition to Jesus. We don't often analyze it and look at what's going on there. And I found myself looking at the resistance to Francis and comparing it with the Pharisees' confrontation with Jesus, and finding an awful lot of similarities. Because it's essentially about rivalry, isn't it? So it's about a refusal to obey, the non-serviam of the angels in the spiritual exercises. Now, obviously, Francis is not Jesus, but he stands for Christ. I mean, in a way, we ask the Pope that he is an alter Christus. He represents Christ. And, of course, what Francis is doing in his papacy is the gospel according to Francis is the gospel according to Jesus Christ, which is a gospel about God's mercy and love as unconditional and universal. Right? That he is close and concrete in the Incarnation. Right? I mean, that's the heart of Francis's message and Jesus's message. And those, of course, are the three things that the Pharisees find impossible to accept, because it means renouncing their control and their monopoly. In other words, that religion ceases to be the thing that you possess, the truth that you possess that others don't. It ceases to be the thing that sets you off against other people, the way of drawing the boundary around you, and a way, of course, of declaring yourself innocent and others guilty. Once religion ceases to be that for you, then it's very threatening. It's very makes you very uncomfortable. So I want to suggest tonight that the resistance to the papacy is a sign that something is happening that is not dissimilar to what was happening with the Pharisees and Jesus, or at least that it's analogous or parallel, and that it's useful. It's not good news, but it's useful because it indicates to us that there is a struggle going on, that this pontificate is a place of spiritual combat. and that by understanding where this combat is taking place, we understand better in the pontificate where real change is happening, where conversion is taking place. In other words, the dogs are barking, the sign that we're advancing. Now, the example I want to give you is the one David has already mentioned, which is the Amazon Synod, where I've just come back from in Rome. I was there for the whole month. What was at the heart of the Amazonia Synod? It was a beautiful synod. I've just done a piece for Commonweal in which I called it a beautiful synod. It was an extraordinary moment in the life of the church. But rather than telling you all about the synod, I just want to pick on a moment right at the beginning, on the 7th of October, when Francis gathered with the indigenous leaders of Amazonia. These are Catholic indigenous leaders in the Basilica of St. Peter's. And this is the first time a synod this has ever happened. He gathered in the Basilica, and they had with them the symbols, which have been really the symbols of the synod, including what became known as the Pachamama idols. In fact, a beautiful wooden figurine of a pregnant woman. Beautiful, beautiful image, which actually is used by the missionaries in the Amazon. They had all these, and they had other things as well with them as symbols of the Amazon. And they walked with Francis out of the Basilica across the square into the Synod aula. It was a wonderful moment, just a beautiful choreo. In the church, everything is ultimately liturgical, right? And it was a kind of liturgical space. It was el pastor con su pueblo, the pastor with his people. And one of the keys to this pontificate, and I say this a lot in the book, is the kind of recovery of a symbiotic connection, a gospel connection, between the shepherd and the people of God. A bond which, of course, has been ruptured by clericalism, by elitism, by abuse. And so in serving the body, in building up the body, the pastor becomes a vehicle, a channel for the Holy Spirit to form the people of God as a people. And this coming into being doesn't replace or reject in any way human culture, but rather brings it to fruition. The seeds of the word are always grown within human culture. So that the purpose of evangelization is that a culture becomes more what it's called to be. So that's why evangelization and inculturation go hand in hand. The respect for culture, for people, for the way they are, is the precondition actually for the word taking root. And that this is something that elites in general, the empire, if you like, fails to grasp because they're caught in the logic of power and control. So they can't see and understand the presence of the divine in the other, in the poor. Yeah. So the empire, in other words, I'm using empire in a very sort of biblical sense. We have the Roman Empire, we have the people of God, we have the empire. The empire looks at the semi-naked people of the Amazon and sees savages, unfortunate poor people who need Christianity and civilization. Christianity understood, of course, as its American expression or European expression. So the Synod, what was the Synod doing? The Synod was rejecting that, if you like, empire hermeneutic and going for another way of viewing the people. The hermeneutic of the shepherd, not that of the colonialists. Christ's way of looking, if you like, at humanity. And in his first speech, Francis said that the pastoral dimension of the Synod was the essential one, the one that encompasses all the others. And he talked about seeing with the eyes of disciples and missionaries, facing the reality, the brutal, terrifying at the moment reality of Amazonia and all the threats that it faces, with the heart of a pastor, with the heart of compassion, respecting their culture, their wisdom, their ancestral connections with nature and all the rest of it, but not in a patronizing way, but to recognize them as protagonists of their own history. And Francis warned in that first speech against colonial mentalities, ideological colonizations, and what he called a homogenizing centralism, which makes the mistake of confusing, what we know as our culture with everything else. And he pointed to history, and he gave two very poignant examples, two famous examples from history of Jesuit missionaries, De Nobili and Ricci, who were enculturated, but ultimately the church, at the time tied to culture, European cultures rejected their attempts at enculturation, and the seed failed to take root in Asia as a result. And he looked at that as a kind of warning. He says, let's not make that mistake. Now, I'm going into this in some length because I'm trying to make clear that really for Francis, this is what the Synod was really all about. And the Synod turned out to be exactly that. It was a beautiful example of evangelization through inculturation. In his final speech, Francis gathers up various themes of the synod, and he says that he warned us journalists not to focus on what one might call secondary questions of ecclesiastical controversies like viri probati and so on, but rather to focus on what he called the diagnoses that the synod made, culturally, socially, pastorally, ecologically. The diagnosis that the synod made, this was where the real weight of the synod could be felt, he said. So what he really meant, what he was saying, was that we have looked at the Amazon with the eyes of the shepherd, with the eyes of the pastor, from the heart of the good shepherd, with that enculturated missionary hermeneutic. And so in doing that, and I'm not quoting him here, I'm kind of interpreting him, that what he meant was that the synod had emulated, in its whole way of approaching this area of the world, had emulated the Cincta Basis, the coming down and coming close of God. The way God comes close to us is how the synod sought to come close to the Amazon. Yeah? Now, this is the heart, I believe, of the Francis reform, to create a church, to bring about a church whose whole way of evangelizing emulates this salvific action of God, of coming close, of walking alongside, of saving and integrating. The merciful, saving God who walks with us, who comes down with us, who comes into our lives, who respects our culture, who helps us through. And all the great works of the pontificate and all the great reforms which are detailed in the book, really, one could argue, can come down to this, to enable the church better to be able to do this. The criteria for picking of cardinals and bishops, the synods, synodality, the actions and the gestures and the speeches of Francis himself are all in a way geared to this end, to bring the church closer, above all, to the wounds of humanity, to bring the church closer to the wounds of humanity, emulating the action of God, so that in emulating the Cincta Basis, we are evangelizing. Now, I say all this, where was the resistance to the synod directed? You can say viri probati, female diaconate. No, there was a vigorous discussion about those issues, as there should be. These are very complex, difficult issues over which people have very different opinions. That's not where the resistance was directed. The resistance was directed, where was the attack? Where was the fury? Where was the contempt? And I want to argue that it was directed precisely at this hermeneutic of closeness, this attempt to be close. Now, the synod begins with a working document which was itself the fruit of a massive consultation of the people of Amazonia that lasted for 2 years, and we heard great stories during the synod of people traveling for days simply to give their views to the church about what was happening to them, to say, this is what's happening to us, we need help, and what we expect of the church. It was a beautiful process. I think the biggest ever consultation of the people of God that the church has ever carried out. And what was their message to the church? We want the church to be close to us. We want it to be present 24/7, not just passing through. Hence the question of access to the Eucharist, hence the question of the recognition of existing ministries and so on. But the point is that the people of God were speaking to the church and saying, we need you with us, we need you beside us. What was the response of the resistance to the working document? It's heretical, they said. It's full of heresies. It's full of doubtful, questionable ideas about nature, and so on. So the working document was immediately criticized. The people spoke, and they were criticized as heretics. And the next thing that happened was that in Rome, at the beginning, before the actual synod began on the previous Friday, there was this ceremony in the Vatican gardens. And I know because I was in Rome, I was walking down the Borgo Pio, and a journalist from EWTN came up to me and he said, what's this? What's this? And I said, well, what? And he showed me a picture of this beautiful wooden figurine of a pregnant woman. He said, who's this? And I said, well, what's going on? Why are you asking me? He said, well, they're worshipping these in the Vatican gardens. And I said, well, first of all, I think it's unlikely that they'll be worshipping them. They probably are part of their ceremony. But I said, why don't you go and ask somebody? Why don't you go and ask one of the indigenous people, what is the meaning of this figurine to you? Why don't you ask one of the pastors who accompanies you? Why don't you ask one of the synod organizers? And I assumed after leaving him that that's what he would do. Next day, there was a story from an EWTN-run news agency which didn't do any of those things, didn't ask a single indigenous person what the meaning was, but described these as pagan fertility symbols which were being worshipped in the Vatican gardens. And that's what then led to this huge eruption on social media. Yeah. So do you see what's happening? The people of God speak, and they're told they're heretics. They pray, and they're told they're pagans and they're idols. So the empire, the resistance to the synod is precisely an attack on the very closeness that the Pope is trying to bring about. And by the way, that ends, as you know, with these 2 figurines, or 5 figurines, excuse me, being thrown into the Tiber, you know, with this video. The man who did that, by the way, has now revealed himself. He's a young Austrian anti-globalist who claims he's acting against the enemies of the church or whatever. But what was so striking was that this video was immediately justified by Cardinal Muller, you know, who said, well, these idols should never have been brought into the church. So I just want to, I'm just illustrating this because I think it's a superb illustration. This synod, in a way, brought together what is the nature of the resistance. The resistance attacks the very thing, the very conversion that the Pope is seeking to bring about. So the core characteristic, or one of the core characteristics of this resistance, and this is true throughout this papacy, is that it appears precisely at the moments, usually in the synods, when the Pope is giving a platform to the voice and the experience of the people. So in his early writings, Bergoglio writes a lot about the different groups in Israel at the time of Jesus, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the Zealots, and so on. And he writes that they all have the same elitist attitude in that they seek to think on behalf of the people and to deny the people their protagonism. And of course, obviously, to take from God the right to create a process and to organize. Yeah. So in a way, this is the idea of arrogation. You take the authority away from God and simultaneously from the people, and you arrogate it to yourself. The other moment of resistance in this pontificate, and it's very striking, is that it appears most vicious precisely at the moment that the Pope and the pastors show forth the wounds of humanity and come close to, and the wounds of the church. And when they demonstrate the unconditional love and compassion of God for the whole of humanity. It's quite striking how often the resistance appears at those moments. Think, for example, way back in 2013, one of the first and most iconic gestures of Pope Francis was to wash the feet of the Muslim woman in the Casal del Marmo juvenile prison in Rome. Do you remember the reaction? It was furious. I remember being in Rome at the time, and some seminarians were furious with the Pope for breaking the rules, as they saw it, the liturgical rules, you know. And then, of course, the national populists were furious because they were Muslims and he was encouraging immigration. Look at the reaction when he brought back the Muslim families from Lesbos. Look at the countless situations in which he is reaching out to people in complex and difficult situations, and he's accused of undermining the law, of diluting Catholic doctrine. It's quite fascinating. Or think just the other day of my friend Jim Martin meeting Pope Francis in Rome, that lovely picture of Francis meeting Jim Martin, and again, the fury that elicited. So I really want to suggest that the resistance is actually really about doctrine. The resistance is doctrinal, and the doctrine that's being attacked here is the very doctrine of the Incarnation. It's the doctrine of mercy that's being attacked here. It is God's very incarnation, his Sancta Basis, that is being undermined. Yeah, that's why the attack on Amoris Laetitia has been so intense, and why it marks a signal moment in many ways of this pontificate. Amoris was attacked for being heretical, even though there is literally nothing in there that is not building on existing Catholic doctrine and law. It changes nothing of sacramental law. It's classic Thomist doctrine of grace and indeed sacramental law on culpability. But there is one sense that Amoris does break, in a way, with traditional papal teaching on marriage. And that is that it says it is not enough simply to proclaim indissolubility as a concept. It is no longer enough to say the church opposes divorce for there not to be divorce, because actually the church has been saying for 25 years, divorce is wrong, indissolubility is right, and that has not prevented the breakdown of marriage across the Western world and including in the Catholic Church. So what Francis is saying is it's no longer enough simply to say it. We have to enable people to live it. We have to be channels of the grace that gives people the strength to actually sustain an indissoluble marriage in a context of liquidity where culture and law don't support that. So I think Amoris, and it features obviously heavily towards the end of this book, Amoris Laetitia leads to beautiful things happening in the church, people coming back to the church, not necessarily back to the communion rail, but people feeling, again, attended to, part of the church, and so on. And of course, it is the very thing that has been attacked. Amoris and the other teachings of this pontificate are in many ways fruit of the discernment of the great meeting of Latin American bishops in May 2007, of which Cardinal Bergoglio was a major protagonist, which is known simply as the Aparecida meeting, and the document that it produced, of which he was the principal author, which is known as the Aparecida document. Now, I know afterwards I'm going to have a discussion here with Mary Kate, who's an expert on Chenu, and I was asking her whether it's true that Chenu was the one who originated the phrase discernment of the signs of the times. In fact, it was John the 23rd. But what's interesting about the discernment of the signs of the times, for which Vatican II calls, is that really it only has ever happened in Latin America, seriously. Yeah. So CELAM, the body of Latin American bishops, have always taken very seriously this idea of discernment of the signs of the times. And Aparecida, I say here, is the most sophisticated diagnosis of modernity and why the church has difficulty evangelizing the modern world, the most sophisticated discernment of anywhere that you'll see anywhere in the church. And the essential discernment of Aparecida is that it is no longer enough to rely on Catholic structures to transmit the faith. The transmission belts are frayed and are broken under the pressure from liquidity, globalization, fragmentation, the dissolution of the bonds of belonging, all the things with which we're familiar if you've read Bauman and all the rest of it. In other words, the diagnosis of modernity isn't particularly interesting or original. What's original is the way that they show that this means that the Catholic Church, that the church, to transmit, to evangelize the faith, has to change. The church has to change in order to evangelize contemporary modernity. How does it have to change? It can no longer rely on those structures, schools, parishes, institutions, and so on, but must offer the experience of the encounter with Christ. What they call in Aparecida el encuentro fundante, the founding encounter, the experience which then changes you and which then, of course, historically leads to the church in the first place. Yeah. Now, just put aside for a moment what we mean by the encounter with Christ in terms of a subjective experience, but rather focus on the divine means or method, right, of enabling that. And Bergoglio has expressed it in a traditional threefold or fourfold dynamic, which you see recurring a lot in his papacy. And there are various ways he expresses it, but you can express it as welcoming, accompanying, discerning, and integrating. So chapter 8 of Amoris Laetitia is accompanying, discerning, and integrating. So sometimes it's 3, sometimes it's 4 stages. But the important thing about this, also his message on migration is the same. It's, welcoming the migrant, promoting, integrating. But this dynamic is one that he has always intuited or perceived as being the action of God in human history. So whenever we have an experience of God, that is how we experience God, right? And that the church, in order to evangelize, has to offer that experience in turn. Okay, so we offer the primary encounter, as you sometimes call it, or the founding encounter. Now, this is really important because it's an experience, it's not an idea. It's an experience. It's what Luigi Giussari called a fact. It's an event, yeah, that the church in evangelizing helps to bring about. It is close and concrete, which is the title of one of these chapters, like the Incarnation itself. It's close, it's proximate, it's God coming close, and it's concrete because it's here and now in history and it directly affects us, and it's a personal experience. So to the extent that the church evangelizes nowadays, it needs to offer that experience. To offer Christ, in other words, as simply an idea or a set of ethical principles is to reduce the truth of Christ to an abstract concept, to deny it, if you like, its fleshiness, right? This is the danger of the gnosis. That the experience of Christ is always inductive, it's pastoral, it's personal, it's life-giving. It's not an assent to an abstract set of propositions. Now, Bergoglio loves to quote Pope Benedict at the beginning of Deus Caritas Est, when Benedict famously says exactly this: Christianity begins not with an ethical proposition or an idea, but an encounter with a person who changes your horizon. So this is really what always Catholic tradition has understood, that the Church offers an experience of God, an experience of Christ, which is close and concrete, incarnational, which is effectively mercy. It shows forth the God of mercy. The good news is expressed in proximity, in action, in compassion towards the suffering, and at the same time, of course, teaching the news of the kingdom and the ethical revolution that must bring about. But the point is, it must begin with the encounter, and then everything else flows from that. And that's why, in his pontificate, one of his greatest achievements, ethically, I think, has been to show that the two major questions of our time, namely ecology and immigration, which, by the way, were the two issues most at the top of concerns of voters in the recent European parliamentary elections, that these two issues touch directly on the gospel, and that to be Christian means to see in the migrant the wounds of Christ, not a threat to our well-being, and to protect and nurture the natural world, to respect creation, is not some lefty, green thing, but again, essential for believers in a loving God who is incarnate in creation rather than objects to be exploited. And again, I come back to the question of resistance. What are the two ethical issues which Francis has most been attacked for by the resistance, by the opposition? It has been ecology and immigration. He's hated for putting those two issues front and center of the Church's ethical concern. Now, I just want to make a couple of observations about the resistance and the nature of it. I have three observations to make. One of them is that much of the resistance operates what one might call its central maze of bunkers here in the US. That's, I think, a well-known fact, with the acquiescence of a number of bishops who, one might say, are in a kind of semi-formal schism. Again, I don't think I'm saying anything controversial here. Maybe 25 or 30 bishops, the ones who praised Archbishop Vigano after he called for the Pope to resign. I remember being interviewed about that, and these bishop statements said, yes, well, we know Archbishop Vigano, he's a very good chap, and we think, his claims should be investigated. Nowhere in the letter they say, but we don't think he should call for the Pope to resign. I remember saying to journalists, this is schism. I mean, this is remarkable for a bishop to do this. Anyway, so we have this. We have also the unmissable fact that the bunker is run and financed by businessmen and lawyers whose organizations are deeply enmeshed, are they not, with the Republican Family Values Project, which is a kind of civic religion, which legitimates itself by its patronage of the Church, but which ultimately regards the Church, I think, as a kind of instrument for achieving its goals, above all resisting the culture of liberal modernity. But not obviously the benefits of the wealth-creating market, which is fine. But in this sense, the analogy, I think, between the US Church now, the analogy in history, I don't know whether historians would agree with this, is 19th century France, where you get this formidable network of very powerful interests, economic and political. You have landowners and lawyers and the military, who are identified, of course, with the restoration of the monarchy, the Ancien Régime, and really they make Catholicism coterminous with reaction, such that really to be Catholic in the early 19th century France is to be a reactionary, is to be a monarchist, is to oppose the revolution and so on. And it takes Leo XIII, remember, at the end of the 19th century to break the Church out of this stranglehold of Catholicism and reaction through the so-called Ralliement, in which he makes clear that actually any form of government is in principle acceptable to the Church. And then in 1891, the first great social encyclical, Rerum Novarum, in which he makes a very concrete turn towards the suffering humanity, the working poor, and he says, no, this is an ethical issue. The dehumanizing state of the market, this is an ethical issue. And in so doing, he was making clear that the Catholic ethical offer could not be reduced to a kind of bourgeois moralism, but must also relate to questions of poverty and wealth and so on. Now, I think you'll see the analogy is pretty clear. What Francis has been doing in the United States has been breaking this stranglehold, the tie, the nexus between parts of the Church and this political, right-wing political family values project, by making clear that the Church's ethical stance cannot be reduced to the Republican Party's ethical priorities of abortion and same-sex marriage, important though those might be, but there are plenty of other ethical considerations. And so in many ways, his effect here, the effect of Francis here, has been very similar to the effect on France of Leo XIII. And I think, again, you can see Laudato Si, there's a parallel with Rerum Novarum. Laudato Si makes clear that ethically you can't care about the destruction of unborn life in the womb without also caring for the destruction of the rainforest, because it's part of the same ethical idea, which is that all is the gift of God. We have been given these things to take care of. So, I mean, in the book, I have a whole chapter on Laudato Si and the effect in the United States, and it's fascinating. The reaction to Francis from many of the elites here was exactly that of the haute bourgeoisie of Europe to Leo XIII, when they said, he has no business in interfering with the science of the market. You know, what does a pope know about economics? You know, how dare he? And it's exactly the same reaction we've had here. So that's my first observation. The second observation is that the real issue in this opposition, in this reaction, as in 19th century France, is the church's relationship with modernity, right? So that the rise of reactionary royalist ultramontanism in 19th century France and the emergence of what one might call the rad trad or right-wing Catholicism in America are very, very similar phenomena. Both have their bishops, both have their kind of token intellectuals and so on. In many cases, in both cases, you find a lot of converts who are fleeing liquid modernity and relativism and are looking for a religiously sanctioned, objective authority capable of resisting modernity. So again, there's a lot of projecting onto the church what is needed psychologically. And again, I think one can draw further analogies. The shock of 1968 and the cultural sexual revolution here, the shock of that and the shock of the French Revolution, I think, are all analogous. Now, my third observation about this is that the reaction has led to the reduction of faith in many cases to an ideology. Now, here's where Bergoglio's own writings, before he became Pope, are rather fascinating, because he shows in a number of his writings how the church, in times of tribulation, when the church feels very attacked and there's terrible stuff happening around, it's easy for the church to lose its trust in God, that God is looking after its church, and to sort of withdraw into itself, into a kind of an ideology. He says this in a number of places as a Jesuit, but he also says it in his letters to Chile and to the United States last year, when he uses this phrase, we are called to discern situations, not to debate ideas. And it's one of those slightly kind of gnomic, obscure phrases which you might not understand, but if you know some of the background of this, you get what he's talking about. In times of tribulation, we are called upon as a church to ask, what is the Holy Spirit asking of us at this time? That's the discernment question. How do we need to change in order to evangelize, to be present in the world? To refuse the discernment question is, in a way, to give in to a kind of temptation, which is to blame others for your misfortune, in the way that the church in recent years, particularly under the last two pontificates, many cardinals would blame the culture for the church's failure to evangelize. That you give into this culture of we're good, they're bad, they're persecuting us, so you have the kind of victim complex. But you also yourself become more and more moralistic and dogmatic, because that's a way of reassuring yourself that you're good and they're bad, that it's all okay, right? And it leads to what Francis calls in Evangelii Gaudium un eticismo sin bondad, which is very badly translated, but I'm going to translate it better, which is a merciless moralism, a kind of pitiless moralism. In other words, to talk about good, but in a way that's basically judgmental and dogmatic, right? Which is why so many people in the Western world perceive the church not as an island of compassion and of mercy, but rather dogmatic, defensive and judgmental. It's not because of the doctrines that the church is defending, but the way in which those doctrines have been divorced from the mercy of God as well, right? So he analyzes really how this state of degeneration leads to us also, he says, a state of permanent anxiety and pessimism. So what's characteristic of this stance is that it's joyless. Does it remind you of anybody that you can think of? A kind of joyless moralism, yeah? Which, and again, this invidia, this seeing everything through this distorted lens. Now, the next bit I'm going to quote because you'll like it. In the mechanism of suspicion, he says, under the guise of love of truth is hidden a refined seeking after pleasure. What is really a matter of the will is concealed behind ideas. In the waterfall of arguments of these religious, he's talking actually about religious people, like religious orders, they demonstrate only their addiction to a hidden pleasure. Right. So this is, I think, really important to understanding a lot of the resistance, that there's this constant appeal to truth and tradition and so on, but really they always start off with the state of anxiety. So classically, an interview with Cardinal Burke or with Cardinal Muller always begins with, given the state of confusion in the church that exists, the terrible state of confusion that people have. And you're thinking, well, who's confused? I'm not confused. Are you confused? People are being told that they're confused. And then, of course, they then offer themselves to resolve this confusion with a series of usually banal regurgitations of the catechism. So this is a sign, in other words, what I'm suggesting is a sign of spiritual desolation, of a failure to put Christ at the center. That this desolation has led many conservatives and traditionalists to distrust, if you like, the shift towards the inductive and discerning, the historically conscious Church of Vatican II, and to retreat into this kind of ideology, into this kind of classicism, the idea that truth exists out there separately from us, and it's a pristine thing, and you either get it or you don't. And very notoriously, I think this leads to them very badly misjudging or very badly diagnosing issues in the church. And the classic one, I think, is clerical sex abuse. If you want a really bad diagnosis of clerical sex abuse, go to Archbishop Vigano or Cardinal Muller or Cardinal Burke. They all say the same thing, which is the reason there has been all this clerical sex abuse is a failure to adhere to church teaching on sexuality. And you think, but some of the most notorious abusers of our time in the Catholic Church have been rigorous, have been, conservative people, highly orthodox about sexual morality. Indeed, one thinks of a man like Cardinal Lopez Trujillo, who spent his career lecturing people on the dangers of homosexuality and was himself a fairly notorious one, as revealed in this recent Martel book. So the point is that there's a sort of failure to discern what's really, really going on because they're locked in this kind of classicist paradigm. And there's one other thing I want to suggest about them while I'm being rude about the opposition or the resistance. I might as well carry on. I think that a lot of the reason that they have a lot of success, in a way, I'm talking here about Muller and Burke and so on, is that their pronouncements are perfectly suited to what one might call a post-truth environment. The post-truth environment, which is the one we now all live in communications, is the one that allows news sites like Breitbart or LifeSite News to thrive. And post-truth, as I understand it, and I'm not sure I do understand it perfectly, but there's a very good little book by Matthew D'Ancona which has helped me to understand that post-truth is really a kind of the consequence of postmodernism is there's no longer truth, there are only narratives. And that post-truth feeds off this kind of alienation and dislocation and grievance and fears. It demands that we choose sides rather than weigh evidence. All that matters ultimately is that the stories feel true. In other words, you appeal primarily to a grievance or a fear, and the rest of it follows on from that, and it doesn't matter whether it's true or not. This is when Trump says that the people coming over the border from Mexico are criminals and terrorists. It's obviously not true, but it's appealing to an emotional feeling that people have, a sense of invasion and threat. And I think this is exactly what some of these leaders of the resistance in the Catholic Church are doing. They start off with this myth that there's confusion in the church, and they then offer to supply a narrative which effectively deals with that confusion. And it's popular because a lot of people do have that feeling and that fear. So what we end up here with is a kind of post-truth theology, and that's what I think they practice. It's not real theology. Theology is discerning, is searching for God and searching for the meaning of God in history and time. What they're doing is something very different, which I call post-truth theology. And of course, it's mediocre theology. It's spouting doctrinal formula, it's rehashed catechetical material, often divorced from its context. It speaks of the Holy Spirit as a concept, but the very way in which they issue their gloomily apocalyptic, lifeless, cliche-ridden pronouncements demonstrate they don't believe in the reality of the Spirit. There is no sense of the Spirit in them. So it paints itself as the authentic interpreter of the tradition, but actually shows itself very far from the tradition in the way that it's articulated. And because it's ultimately self-referential and self-validating, it's essentially, I think, relativistic. Now, Just want to end here because I know I've gone on almost too long. I haven't quite reached my 45 minutes. But my last thing I just want to suggest about the resistance is this term isolated conscience. Now, the term isolated conscience is used by Francis in Evangelii Gaudium right at the start in the second paragraph, but you don't know because it's been badly translated. Conciencia aislada in Spanish, and they've translated into English as blunted conscience, which it really isn't. What he's talking about right at the beginning of Evangelii Gaudium is how the joy of the gospel fills the hearts and the lives of all who encounter Jesus, right? Setting them free from sin and sorrow and emptiness. And he's encouraging the church, us, the Christians, to embark upon a new chapter of evangelization to communicate this. But then immediately in paragraph 2, this is very typical of Bergoglio, points out the obstacle to that, which is what he calls the desolation and anguish born of a complacent yet covetous heart, of the feverish pursuit of frivolous pleasures and of an isolated conscience. Now, when you go back to his writings, his earlier writings, he writes a lot about the isolated conscience, which is when people withdraw from the body of Christ, from the people of God, when they take refuge in this kind of elite separation, where they start to believe in their own ideas. They disconnect themselves from the body. It's a spirit of self-sufficiency, a spirit of basically of attachment to power. Yeah. So I think in some of the analysis that he has in his early writings of the isolated conscience, we have a lot of the answer to what's happening in our church at the moment. And that there's usually, he says, involved in the isolated consciousness, a covetousness, a need to cling to something, power or wealth or privilege or whatever it is. It's a desire to hang on to that attachment, which gradually leads people. And I think, again, that gives us an interesting clue why so much of the resistance to Francis comes from people, let's face it, who are very attached to wealth and honor and pride and power. In an interview in 2007, a fascinating interview, he used the expression isolated conscience in relation to the prophet Jonah. You know the great story of the prophet who is sent by God to evangelize Nineveh. He tries to evade that mission by going back to Tarshish and ends up inside the whale. You know the story. Really, the refusal that Nineveh made to the Lord was because the Lord's mercy towards Nineveh didn't fit in with his own plans. This is what Bergoglio says. His own need of control, his own need of identity. Bergoglio says Jonah had become a prisoner of his own certainties. He had fenced in his soul with the barbed wire of those certainties that instead of giving freedom to God and opening up horizons, end up deafening his heart. How the isolated conscience hardens the heart, he says. Jonah knew nothing of God's ability to lead his people with the heart of the Father. And this, he says, is the risk of the isolated conscience, of those who from the closed world of their Tarshishes complain about everything, or feeling their identity threatened, undertake battles to feel more busy and involved. So like Jonah refusing the mission to Nineveh, trying to head back to Tarshish, the resistance to Francis, the result of an isolated conscience, I want to suggest tonight, my friends, is ultimately a refusal to evangelize. It's a resistance to evangelization. It is a refusal of God's mercy and the universality of his love for all people. So to understand this, I think, helps us to understand what's going on, the temptations also of our time. It helps us to see where the real change is happening in this pontificate by looking at the resistance. Francis, on the plane back from Mauritius in September, spoke about schisms. He said, schisms have always happened. They're inevitable. That's part of the freedom. He doesn't want to see a schism, but he's relaxed about it. But he went on to say precisely that schism has this element that begins with people separating themselves from the faith of the people of God. It's always an elitist separation, which stems from an ideology detached from doctrine. But then he added, we need to be gentle with those who are tempted by these attacks. And I hope tonight, even though I've been quite rude and quite critical, I hope I've also been gentle, because what he says here is they're going through a tough time. We must accompany them gently. We must always win over opposition and resistance with love, just as Jesus calling down Zacchaeus from the sycamore tree. That's what we must do with the resistance to Francis. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Austen. Thank you so much, Austen. Do you need the iPad or no? Yeah, you can just get up here. And as they're making their way to the dais, just as they're getting settled in, just a word about our moderator this evening. Mary Kate Holman is a doctoral candidate in systematic theology here at Fordham with research interests in ecclesiology, feminist theology, and the history of Nouvelle Théologie. Her dissertation is on the signs of the times in the life and thought of Marie Dominique Chenu. Mary Kate earned her BA in English literature from Georgetown, earned her master's in theological studies from Boston College in 2014, and on her third try finally landed at the best Jesuit university in America. She teaches undergraduate courses on faith and critical reason and the church in controversy, which makes her perfectly positioned for our conversation this evening. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Hi. And thank you, Austen, for that excellent presentation. It's really an honor to be able to engage you on some of these ideas that are so pressing for our church. Well, David mentioned my background at 3 Jesuit institutions, and the first question I wanted to ask you is, we are at a Jesuit university here, and throughout your book and throughout your talk, you mentioned several moments in which you see the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius really forming the way that Francis views the world. So I was wondering if you might be able to sort of speak about how this Ignatian worldview particularly informs Francis's approach to conversion for the church.
Yeah, thanks. Can you hear me okay? Yeah. Yes, I mean, at the heart of everything Francis does, at the heart of his leadership of the church, is discernment. I mean, I think that's the simple answer. Which means what? Which means that he's constantly asking the question that I said in the talk that we have to ask, which is, what is the Holy Spirit asking of us now at this moment, how we need to change? So, yes, it's a process of constant conversion. And I think there's a trust in the processes. So he often talks about processes. You know, he's a man of processes. He opens up those processes. And the processes are about enabling the church to put Christ at the center. And then the changes will flow from that. So in other words, and that's partly, by the way, the difference of the title. The Great Reformer, which I quite like as a title, because I think he is a great reformer, but there's a slight element of triumphalism there. You know, as I say at the beginning of this book, it can give the idea that here's the great man of history who appears at a particular moment, you know, to resolve everything, and really that's not the way he works. It's a much more a leadership, and I go into it in some depth in one of the chapters on curial reform. It's a very patient kind of leadership where he's operating within the limitations, and in the Vatican there are not a few limitations. Of personnel, of people, and so on. So there's a patience, and there's a kind of trusting in the processes, which ultimately the Spirit is leading. There are 2 places in the book where I really go into how this discernment has directly affected his leadership. One of them I've already mentioned, which is the Aparecida vision of evangelization. And the second one is the sex abuse crisis. There's a quite dramatic moment in my chapter 5, which you all know about, which is Chile, beginning of 2018, and where he starts to realize that sex abuse can't be tackled by means of policies alone, that this is a question actually of deep-seated corruption, and that the reason that these stories are being revealed about the past is the Holy Spirit is revealing something to us about clericalism, about power, about self-entitlement, which we need to confront. And in confronting it, we face the truth. This is very spiritual exercises. We face the truth, we experience shame, deep-seated shame, and that shame causes us then to turn and depend on the mercy of God. And insofar as we allow that mercy then to change us, we then move into being evangelizers. So that process of conversion, which is at the heart of in a way, of every Christian conversion, is, in a sense, what he's helping to bring about in the church. I think that's where I see the Ignatian leadership very strongly.
Yeah. And that, you talk about it being like a patient leadership. I think there are certainly folks on both sides that are very impatient with that motion. But and that's actually leads me to another question. I would like you to speak a little bit about how you see the genre of your book. I know that you are a historian, obviously, so your thesis, also a journalist, and there you weave together a lot of biographical information about Bergoglio before he's Francis, and then a lot of sort of intrigue about the way that the Vatican is operating now, sort of more journalistic. And it also seems, and forgive me if I'm misinterpreting you here, but as sort of a full-throated defense of Francis, both against progressives who might be more impatient with his leadership, and then you spoke more about, obviously, the conservatives who are mounting more sort of vicious opposition. So between history, journalism, sort of apologetics, where do you situate your book?
Oh dear. Yes, good question. Well, I mean, I think the genre is narrative nonfiction. So it's narrative because it's telling stories, and in a way the book is constructed around what I think, in my own discernment, will be the things that in 10, 15 years' time people will look back and say, those are the important things of the pontificate. I don't try and cover everything. For example, ecumenism and interreligious dialogue and diplomacy is very lightly touched on in the book. So it's not supposed to be comprehensive. So it's touching on moments, I suppose, of tension and change and conflict, which is what we journalists like, of course, and all writers like to write about. But also they're also illustrative of dynamics. I mean, in terms of my own objectivity or my own view, I mean, the Great Reformer was criticized for being hagiographical by some, and the same word has already been used in one review of this book. I do wonder about the term hagiography. I mean, hagiography implies that you set out to burnish somebody's reputation. I really haven't done that in either book. I've really gone where the story has taken me. I've kept a very open mind. I don't see it, it's true, and this is where I think I'm different from some journalistic colleagues who do a kind of checklist of these are the good things that Francis has done, these are the bad things, here's where he needs to improve, And every year, the anniversary of his election, we get this sort of checklist, And I think my role isn't, I don't see my role as doing that. My role is to explain how he thinks and what he's doing. And not in a way to stand in judgment over him. I don't feel that's my role. On the other hand, I'm not trying to hide things that he's got wrong, and in fact, chapter 5 has a lot about what he got wrong in the sex abuse crisis. And I very much acknowledge the impatience with the Pope in terms of certain reforms, and particularly from the more progressive section of the Church, there's obviously a great impatience. Why aren't more women being put into positions of authority? Why has he been so slow to embrace the female diaconate and so on? And I totally get the impatience with those reforms, except that when you see it from his point of view, and when you're looking at him, and you look at what a pope can do and how he can do it, I think actually he's been very wise in the way he's done things, because if you push things too far, it produces pushback. And I mean, just on the female diaconate, for example, as you know, there was a commission appointed which disagreed. They all just ended up disagreeing with each other, as we probably knew they would. So Francis then says, well, I've got this report which is inconclusive. But he then calls an Amazon Synod, which he knows will call for the female diaconate, and which says in the Amazon Synod document, we would like to contribute to the commission. And Francis says in response, directly to the women at the Synod, you've thrown down the gauntlet, I take it up, I'm going to reopen the commission now with new members. That feels to me like he's moving, you see. But it's moving at a pace which some people regard as too slow, but I think is in many ways very wise. So I think my role is to explain, to provide a narrative account of this pontificate, which helps you to understand how he thinks and what he's doing.
Yeah.
Which for some people will be not critical enough. And I accept that.
Makes sense. You wouldn't spend years writing 2 books about someone you didn't admire.
Right.
Yeah. Well, and it's very clear from the book that you see Francis's vision of converting the church towards, you mentioned often, the image of the church is the people of God, not simply, or not primarily like a clerical hierarchy or an institution or a bureaucracy, any of those things. And it seems to me that you are very taken with that vision. I am very taken with that vision. But I was noticing in the book that so much of it is about sort of the institutional and the hierarchical and the clerical conversations. And so I was really struck by this difference between Francis's vision of the church, but then the church he's got that he's mired in, all of this. And so I'm wondering, there is a question that lurks under the surface here, and I'm wondering if it's that, can the clerical system ever fully fix itself? Even, Francis denounces clericalism, but is himself a cleric. I'd just like you to reflect on that tension for a little bit.
I mean, he's often described as an outsider and a radical and a reformer and so on. And of course, in many ways he is, because he hated Rome before he became Pope. I mean, that was no secret. He used to go every February as a cardinal. He used to say to his people in the office it was his Lenten penance. And he used to get back as soon as he could. He hated the pomp, he hated the hypocrisy, he hated the corruption in Rome. But then again, he's very much a priest, and he's very much a creature of the priesthood and the Jesuits. So, one can exaggerate too much. There's often a media sort of portrayal of Francis as some kind of maverick. He really isn't. He comes out of a very, very deep ecclesiastical tradition in Latin America. And in fact, I mean, part of the explanation of why he becomes Pope is that he's already become the de facto leader of the Latin American church. I mean, he's so deeply admired in Latin America. And, for example, on celibacy, he said, I'm not going to change the rule on celibacy. That will never happen under my pontificate. Celibacy is a great gift. And he has lived celibacy as a great gift, and he's seen its fruits. So in that sense, he's not going to... But he's also called the Amazon Synod, which has called for viri probati, that actually the actual proposal is that deacons, permanent deacons, be ordained in certain circumstances in Amazonia. I don't know what Francis will say in response to the final report, but he must have known that was coming. And again, he's very willing to be flexible if there's a really good pastoral reason for something. But he has, I mean, you're an expert on the Nouvelle Theologie. It's very much a Congarian view. All reform is ultimately pastoral. It's for the salus animarum. So he's always operating within a context, and he will never operate outside it, which I think is why he's so effective, actually. It's why... I think that's my Siri. I think I must have said something that triggered him. Yes, I've now completely lost my train of thought. Well, but I think that's why he can achieve actually very substantial change. It's precisely because he understands the church very well. He understands clergy. And just on clericalism, I mean, let's not confuse priesthood and clericalism. Clericalism is a perversion of the priesthood. And one of the things he's very clear about on the sex abuse crisis is that here is this thing, the priesthood, ministeriality, which is created, if you like, as a vehicle of service to wash the feet of the poor, which has been perverted into a weapon of control and domination and sexual exploitation. I mean, that's diabolical perversion. And in a way, he sees as a Jesuit, he sees the church has all these good things, priesthood, celibacy, and so on, that have been corrupted. And I say in the book, I use the Latin phrase, which I'm sure you're familiar with, corruptio optimo pessima est. The corruption of the best is always the worst kind of corruption. And I think that's what he's dealing with, is corruption of the good.
I'm glad that you mentioned the way that Francis denounces clericalism, because that is, prior to that word becoming kind of a punching bag for all sorts of people in the wake of the most recent sex abuse allegations, it was clear that Francis already denounced clericalism. I wonder if it might be helpful to expand our definition of clericalism beyond even what Francis can see. As David mentioned, I'm an expert in feminist theology, and I do wonder if maybe the Roman Catholic Church has a particular problem with clericalism that other denominations that have priests do not, because priesthood is reserved to so few of the actual population of the church. So I do wonder if that might be something Francis misses because he lives it, yeah.
It's a very good question. The Australian Royal Commission into abuse in the Australian Catholic Church, which I think I'm safe in saying, David will contradict me, is probably the most systematic report ever into the church. It was a 4-year commission. And they have a lot to say about clericalism and the culture that it's created and the links between an all-male celibate priesthood and clericalism. There's unquestionably a link. And there are all sorts of things that I think have ended up corrupting or changing the priesthood. One of them is homosexuality being dishonestly lived at very high levels of the priesthood. But these are very big and complex questions. I don't have how to reform the priesthood, but his basic approach and his reform of the priesthood, which I think has gone under the radar, but has actually been quite radical. If you look at the what's called the Ratio Studorum, which is the new framework for the training of priests, which came out very, very quietly in 2016, boy, you read that and you think, wow, if priests were all like this, we would not be having these conversations. And of course, it's very much about we have to lose this idea of status, of power, of privilege, of elitism, and its service. It's poverty. It's radical service. It's option for the poor. It's the pastor is the one who walks with and accompanies and is close to the wounds of humanity and so on. And so he sees the priesthood as being a way of emulating, again, the Sancta Acabasis, the way God comes close to us. And I think he holds that ideal very closely, and I think he's helping to bring it about.
Well, I'll ask you one more question before we do open it up to our audience. We are in the American church here. I mean, most of us are probably affiliated somehow with the American Catholic Church, and you identify that this really is the seat of much of the opposition. I'll read a line that you quote that's often cited from Evangelii Gaudium that I think became sort of newly appropriate in our own context here. Francis says in that document, "The Eucharist is not a prize for the perfect, but a powerful medicine and nourishment for the weak." And here in the U.S., only last week, Joe Biden was denied communion on the campaign trail by a parish priest in South Carolina, who then contacted journalists about it to sort of make this a story. So I'd like to ask you, what suggestions do you have for those of us in America who are embroiled in this sort of culture war Catholicism that really does contrast with what Francis is obviously saying in this document and throughout his papacy?
Well, I mean, the first thing to say is that I do actually love the American church, and I really admire the American church. And my experience of American Catholicism is that the people are with the Pope. I mean, the people always are with the Pope, right? So we are talking here about particular groups and elites and so on. And yeah, bishops like this one. I mean, Cardinal Dolan, I noticed, immediately said he would not have liturgized the Eucharist in that way. I think when the Eucharist is used as an instrument of control like that, it's totally violates the sacrament itself, And I think, so Francis's phrase in Evangelii Gaudium is taken, in fact, from Cardinal Martini, the idea of, the Eucharist as a... So to understand the sacraments are really a source of grace for the weak, I mean, the sacraments do not exist as a reward. They're not a prize. They're not a way of establishing our righteousness. They are ways in which God helps us in our weakness. And that's certainly how Francis sees it. And the idea, therefore, that you would very publicly refuse a politician communion in order to make a point just seems to me to violate the whole point of the Eucharist. By all means, he can criticize Biden's positions on all kinds of things outside the communion realm. But, yeah. So my suggestions for you. Well, I think Francis's vision for the American Church was very well laid out when he was here in September 2015, in that wonderful address to the bishops in Washington, D.C., where he says it's really worth keep rereading that and say this is his vision for the church. Basically pull away from the culture wars. Don't make the gospel an instrument of a cultural battle, but rather, I think he used the image of a fire. Ultimately, all evangelization is creating a welcoming, is learning how to welcome people, and expanding the table. It's not just about feeding the hungry, but bringing the hungry actually onto your table to expand the people of God. That's why the image of a banquet and joy and so on is so important. I think that's the vision of Francis, and I think the other strategy, which has been to focus on legislative battles, alliances with political parties, to seek to reconquer the public square, it's failed. It's failed spectacularly, and it's led to the biggest loss of Catholics from the church, I think, in recent history. I mean, it has failed, I mean, Cardinal Farrell said to me, you know, he was formerly bishop in Dallas, wasn't he? Yeah, Bishop of Dallas. And I remember him saying to me, you know, that he used to go around the schools and the kids would all be totally against abortion, but they couldn't tell you why abortion was wrong, and they couldn't tell you anything about Jesus Christ, you know. So there was something wrong there, and that's where I think the American Church needs to go back to its roots, which is where its greatness, I think, comes from. Yeah. And the other thing that always strikes me about America is, you know, these very, very powerful institutions. I mean, wow, the church here is incredibly strong, wonderful institutions. But of course, the danger of that is that you end up managing institutions rather than evangelizing. And I think that's always been the managerial functionalist temptation is one that I think Francis is always reminding people about.
Yeah, well, thank you. So we do have 2 microphones available for questions. I would just ask, first of all, to make sure that you are asking a question. I know we all have lots of ideas and stories and reactions that we want to share, and we have cocktails and snacks, and you can do that then. So if you have a question for our guest here, please step forward to the microphone, and please keep your question around 30 seconds so that we can all benefit from this time with our esteemed guest.
And don't ask about Brexit.
Ask about Brexit. Yeah, so maybe you'll go first, and then we'll get to you after him. Mm-hmm.
Andrea Bartoli, Community of Sant'Egidio, wonderful presentation, fantastic indeed. I really enjoy your closing with Zacchaeus, because all of us who go to Mass heard the encounter just Sunday. And it's interesting because it's a moment in which Jesus himself seems to be opening himself to the Spirit. He doesn't say anything to Zacchaeus. Zacchaeus is the one that is speaking, and yet there is a resistance. And the resistance is a resistance that wants to silence both Jesus and Zacchaeus. So it's an interesting moment. But Jesus' response is fundamentally ignore them. Listen to Zacchaeus. Give the floor to Zacchaeus. Give the floor to the life that is really encountered. So I was wondering if you could tell us more about the charismatic Francis. You wrote about it, it's clearly there, and I feel that we all need to hear, you know, the Spirit that speaks through Francis.
Thank you, Andrea. Yeah, I mean, there is something I think that I did in the Great Reformer, which nobody else had sort of spotted, which was his closeness to the charismatic renewal. And I go into it a little bit in this book as well. And I've been at various events in Rome where Francis has presided over and he's clearly completely at home with the renewal. The way, of course, he's put the Holy Spirit front and center of his own discernment, but also of his messages, is also very, very striking. If you compare Francis's speeches with previous popes, the Holy Spirit is there a lot. And the characteristics of the Spirit, you know, joy, consolation, you know, just look at the titles of his teaching documents. They all have the word joy in them. You know? Evangelii Gaudium, even the one on universities is called Veritatis Gaudium, Gaudate et Exultate, and so on. So I think part of his diagnosis of the Aparecida diagnosis of the contemporary Western Church is that the Western Church is in desolation. It lacks, therefore, those signs of consolation. So that the Church now needs a new openness to the Spirit. So his view of the charismatic renewal is that the renewal is for the whole Church. And he's quite strict with them. He says, this is not just for you to hang on to. He's very critical of the way some groups of the renewal have tried to kind of use it. He says, no, this is for the whole Church. The whole Church needs to become charismatic. And just one other point on that is that one of the most remarkable ecumenical initiatives of this pontificate has been the outreach to evangelicals and Pentecostals, which really before this pontificate wasn't happening very much. He holds really remarkable meetings with evangelicals and Pentecostals who just love him, and they say, this man is baptized in the Spirit. I've spoken to many of them. Here in New York, there's a pastor in Brooklyn called Joe Torsini, who's created something called the John 17 movement, where he basically takes all these pastors and evangelicals to Rome. They meet with Francis, and they all regard him as their spiritual leader. It's really quite interesting. I want to write about that, by the way, in a kind of next book. But so yeah, the charismatic Francis. Thanks for the question. Very important part of him. Thank you.
Great. We'll have you now, please.
Shall I take it down here? No, can you hear me? You said that you explain Francis's thinking, and one of the decisions that he made very early on in his pontificate, probably within the first 6 weeks, was that he accepted the report on U.S. women religious. And when I hear you talk about the clericalism and the experience of God, I would think that American women religious were the opposite of clericalism. So did he make a mistake? What was he thinking? Was he held hostage in some way? I'm still, to this day, very confused about that.
But you say he accepted the report.
He accepted the report.
But in what sense did he accept it?
The report was finished, and he accepted it. As I understood, the representatives of women religious went to Rome, and he could have put it on the back burner, let it write itself out, and not given any kind of legitimacy to it.
Because my understanding of what he did with that report was that he simply accepted it, but he didn't.
But by accepting it, he could have had the other alternative by letting it roll away.
Yeah, but I mean, my understanding, he hasn't acted on it. I mean, that was a report that was begun under the previous Pope, wasn't it? And that he, yeah. And so that process was going on when he became Pope. So the report was given to him, he accepted it. But in fact, he put a stop to what was actually a kind of an inquisition.
Might have been more cathartic if he had said something more
Absolutely.
rejected.
You mean he should have criticized it or rejected it?
No, what I'm saying is he could have just put it in the safe
Yeah.
and not responded to it at all. Because I do know that the leaders who were there were just dumbfounded. So that's always
Because
caused me
he
some
told
trouble.
them that he accepted.
That he accepted it, yes.
Has he? And then did he do anything about it? Yeah.
No, he's busy about clerics.
Yeah.
Well, because the reason I
But it
ask
certainly
is
has had a damper effect
okay. Well, it's
on
interesting,
women
it's interesting
religious.
because I know many of the UISG superiors general. I've spoken to them. They have developed a remarkable relationship with him. I mean, those annual meetings with the Pope are really amazing. They're some of the most interesting relationships he has, I think, as Pope. And so I don't think that they feel that he's not on their side. I think he feels that they feel that he is. So.
Yes, I'm talking about the nun in the street.
Thank you so much. Yeah, would you like to ask your
Ryan.
question?
I was wondering if you could expand a little bit on the opening you gave yourself at the very end of your presentation, in which you talked about winning people over. In fact, as you know very well, you're a co-founder of a group, Catholic Voices, which sort of specialized in that very idea of when you're engaging with the critic of the church to say, well, here's something that we absolutely fundamentally agree with. This is a common position, and then presenting a larger context. So in engaging in conservative critics, I mean, there's some people who seem to be on a completely different planet, but there are maybe others who just sort of grew up in which John Paul II was, their ideal of Pope, and that's all they understood. So for those people, how would you develop a Catholic answers style version of engagement with them?
Well, and I hope I stress that when I'm talking about a particular kind of resistance in this talk, which was the brazen, naked rejection of. But I agree, there's a lot of people who are just simply uncomfortable with Francis, don't understand him, feel disconcerted, and there's no question. I mean, when I set out to write Wounded Shepherd, I actually my original vision for the book was to explain the Aparecida vision, and to account for the shock that it has been. Evangelii Gaudium, I think, to this day remains a very shocking document. The way it was written, I don't think people really understood it. The whole style of it was direct, it was pastoral, it was charismatic, it was, and I think, so that's what I set out to explain. But I realized that wasn't sufficient. No, I've, you imagine I give a lot of presentations, in lots of different countries. In Poland, for example, I had a very frosty reception for my previous book. And I realized during the book launch that their problem with Francis was that he wasn't John Paul II. Although I think they had a particular image of John Paul II, which was rather particularly Polish. But so no, I understand that Francis, and we all have our preferred popes. Most of you will probably say, John the 23rd was my pope, or Paul the 6th was my pope, and that's inevitable. Yeah, hey, Francis is my pope. I make no secret of it. But I understand why he isn't for other people. But I think that's very different from the withdrawal of loyalty and fealty, which I see in some people. Which, by the way, you know, I'm from a fairly liberal, progressive Catholic background. I used to work for the Tablet in England, which would be like Commonweal here. But, you know, I was a great defender of the Benedict papacy. I went on the media. I defended Benedict all the time, you know. And it's funny, I get told all the time now, well, you know, you defend the Pope, you didn't when it was Benedict. No, I did. You know, it's normal. Catholics are with the Pope. This used to be traditional church understanding, you know. So, but I agree. We have to work out better ways of dialoguing. We have to overcome the polarization in the church. And just a little shout out here for the initiative in Georgetown, for example, which you probably know about, where they're bringing together. I think we need to do more of that. Thanks, Brian.
Great, yeah.
I really enjoyed your presentation. Years ago, when Benedict resigned, in this country, Frontline is a very interesting program that public television provides, and there was an expose about what led to Benedict's resignation. And they spoke about the corruption in the bank. They spoke about the clericalism. They spoke about the sex abuse. And Benedict had commissioned a group of people, psychologists and I don't know who all, and they brought back their assessment that at the core of the sex abuse scandal was the mandatory celibacy. And it was after all of this was provided to Benedict, according to this Frontline expose, that he decided to resign, that it just wasn't his mission to continue with this. And I just want you, my question is, can you be a little more specific? Maybe I didn't hear exactly. What does Pope Francis think is the primary cause of the sexual abuse scandal in this world?
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, just the first part, I simply don't believe what Frontline says. I don't know. I've never heard about this report of psychologists that says that the cause of clerical sex abuse was mandatory celibacy, because all the expert studies that have been commissioned, John Jay and all the rest of it, do not say that. They say that celibacy it can be a factor in clericalism and cover-up and so on, but per se celibacy, you know, there isn't a proximate cause of sex abuse. You can't say it's because of homosexuality or because of celibacy or because of, these are all factors which are involved, but the basic cause of clerical sex abuse, and this is very much Francis's diagnosis, is that it is ultimately an abuse of power. It's and because ordinarily sex abuse goes along with abuse of power and abuse of conscience as well. It's actually not dissimilar to sex abuse carried out by teachers or by pop stars, by people who believe that they have a sense of self-entitlement. Okay, so it's the perversion of the priesthood, which is a means of power, which often makes them narcissistic. So Father Hans Zollner, who's the top, I think, church expert on this, is very good on this, the clericalist narcissist, you know, who believes that he's somehow special because he's ordained, you know, and so he, if you like, perverts the real meaning of ordination, says, no, I'm special. Therefore, I can sort of take off the mask at night and do what I like, and it's okay because I'm good, you know. And that's really the cause of it. So it's a perversion of the priesthood, which is about power. That's essentially the diagnosis that Francis makes, that we will never extirpate clerical sex abuse until we extirpate the mentality of clericalism, which facilitates it, covers it up, and all the rest of it. Yeah? But I think Benedict resigned for the reason that he gave, which was physical frailty.
All right, thank you. We'll take one last question from you, and then I'll ask my one last question, and we'll wrap up. Thank you.
Okay, great. So did Pope John Paul II and Pope Benedict XVI face a similar sort of white-hot resistance, well-funded, as Francis is now facing? And then kind of my follow-up is, who will be the next pope?
Ask David Gibson. Yes. Well, the answer to the first question is no. You know, I think this is unique, this resistance. I mean, I'm very struck actually by some of the rhetoric of the resistance to Francis is not dissimilar to that of Marxist liberation theologians under John Paul II, who would basically denied the Pope his leadership. They said, ignore Rome. So it's very similar because it's basically ideological in both cases. Yeah, but no, this opposition is unique. I think it's, as I said in the talk, has everything to do with America, has everything to do with the particular alliance that grew up under John Paul II, of which First Things and George Weigel and others were, of course, major agents of this alliance, effectively with conservative evangelicals to retake the public square. And I think that political project has failed and it's been undone, by this papacy, and that's why they dislike him so much. Who will be the next pope? I think one of the most radical reforms of this papacy, and I go into the book, is the reform of the College of Cardinals. Not just the cardinals that he has chosen, but the criteria he has used for choosing them. And I explain in the book that previously, before Francis, there were more and more cardinals from the developing world, but the cardinals were still chosen according to the traditional logic, which is that where you get an important urban center of Catholicism, you appoint a cardinal. In other words, the center dynamic remained. Francis has broken the center dynamic by appointing cardinals from obscure parts of the world and of the church. In other words, Pacific Islands where there are 150,000 Catholics. And I have fun in the book, some of them really are, some of them aren't even bishops, And the way they find out, of course, is great fun because they all find out the same way, which is when he reads out the names. Because Francis, he was asked about this, why don't you let us know in advance? And he says, well, because I don't want all this jostling and why him and not me. And he says, I just read it out so we all find out at the same time. And one of the cardinals, Panamanian cardinals, said to him, but one of these days you're going to give somebody a heart attack. to which Francis replied, oh, well, that's good. That'll find out whether they're worth picking as cardinals. But it's delightful, I think, the way they find out. They often find out because their cousin's seen it on television, and they get the text messages and they don't believe it. And there's something very gospel, there's something very magnificat about it, that the little people are chosen. Now, the effect of these, what I call little David picks in the College of Cardinals in the next conclave will be fascinating, because you get people who are on the front line of interreligious dialogue, of conflict, and so on. Pastoral bishops, in other words, choosing the next pope. And I think that, therefore, it will be a much more pastoral conclave, much less divided, much less polarized on ideological grounds, much more pastoral, much more focused on the needs of humanity. And therefore, I think it'll be a fascinating kind of real discernment in a way that we probably haven't seen in any previous conclave, which means it's impossible to answer your question.
And funnily enough, my original last question, which I will now alter, was going to say, you share some really lovely stories of Francis's selection of unexpected cardinals in the book and how they find out. So instead, I'll ask, Francis has articulated a desire to execute the vision of a synodal church in light of Vatican II. And you spoke a little bit about your experience at the Amazon Synod. Could you explain for us what Francis means by a synodal church, besides just a church that has synods?
Yeah,
what is a synodal church, and how did you see it happening at the Amazon Synod?
This could be the subject of a whole lecture, because synodality is, I've just said, one of the most important reforms. In a way, the most important reform of this pontificate has been to introduce synodality into the church. It was the big thing that hadn't happened after Vatican II that should have happened, and there are all sorts of reasons why it didn't happen. A synodal church is one that listens very carefully, that teaches by listening, and that it involves and enables participation. It's not a democracy. Synods are still synods of bishops, only bishops vote. But as we've just seen in the Amazon Synod or the Synod on Youth last year, you can have huge numbers of people who aren't voting participating in the Synod. There were close to 300 people participating in this Synod, 180 voting fathers. And this listening that I described, the consultation of the people of God beforehand, roots and grounds the church constantly in the pastoral realities of the people. And therefore you get this wonderful tension, creative, fruitful tension between the tradition and teaching of the church and the pastoral realities of humanity. And you bring them into tension. and you listen, Francis says, listen carefully, speak boldly, you're allowed to say whatever you like, and then he trusts that actually through this process, partly because he's there, and he's the successor of St. Peter, that there is a mechanism of ecclesial discernment that allows the church to move forward, not by changing doctrine and law, but rather in the application of the doctrine to concrete pastoral circumstances. This is essentially the dynamic of the early church. It's the Council of Jerusalem and so on. So the reintroduction of that same dynamic, which is the dynamic of Vatican II, into the contemporary church is one of the most important and long-lasting and far-reaching changes that Francis has brought about. And I think probably the signal change for which he will be most remembered.
Yeah. Great. Well, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. It's been lovely to be with you. Thank you.